Welcome to a new story for a new week, the Earth Story Podcast. My name is Will Rand, and it is a gift to share this time with you. This week we are joined by Grace Alexander, violinist, creative leader, collaborator, and tree conservationist. Grace grew up between the bustling density of Los Angeles and the serene and interconnected forests and mountains of Plains, Montana. In Montana, Grace and her dad take care of a large tree farm. They are keenly aware of all the different ecosystems, plant communities, and the needs of the trees in their forest. Grace is a keeper of her family's stories. She carries forward the visionary wisdom instilled in her by her grandfather and her mother in their quest to preserve the wilderness in western Montana. Grace has assumed a much more significant responsibility and a duty of care for her family home. She is an example for how humans can tend to the land as essential companions with hands and feet. Just as Ellery and Sophie spoke of gardening as a communal way to tend to an ecological cycle that has evolved and revolved cyclically for billions of years, Grace speaks to the way human beings can be attentive to the cyclical needs of the forest.
I grew up between Santa Monica, California, and Plains, Montana. My mom and her side of the family is originally from Montana and North Dakota primarily, and my dad's side of the family is primarily from Los Angeles. They're multi-generational Angelinos, as they call it. I grew up with sort of a contrasting lifestyle between the huge metropolis that is Los Angeles and a very rural part of northwest Montana. So between those two places, I spent about half of my time in each place growing up for the first 4 or 5 years of my life. And beyond that, once I got into school, my mom knew and sort of decided in her head long before I was around that having an education in a bigger city was really important to her. Being exposed to lots of people with very diverse perspectives coming from all around the world was a crucial part of who she wanted me to surround myself with. And also having that experience in a very rural part of the country where maybe people have lived there their families have been there for 100 years in a place like Plains, and even before that, So I think having those two experiences was a really important part of who she wanted me to be as a person, to embody the rural perspective of life while also having the very intense, chaotic, at times, city life experience. And in my life, that looked very different in terms of the nature that I experienced from time to time. So, in Los Angeles, I'm 10 blocks away from the beach, which is such a privilege, and to watch beautiful sunsets every night, but it was in the midst of sort of a concrete jungle. When I would go to Montana in the summers, it was just a complete 180 from my life in California, and it felt like when I was a kid, people would say, "Oh, you're living a double life. You're just like Hannah Montana." And I took that as a huge compliment because I thought, "Oh man, like that, you're right." And I am so lucky to have had the experience of living in a place where my dad's side of the family had such strong ties, and he grew up in Los Angeles and his dad grew up in Los Angeles, and those multi-generational aspects, but also get to experience such an amazing part of the country in Montana and be surrounded by family there as well. So I consider myself very blessed to have grown up in both places, but it has definitely impacted my relationship with having an appreciation for the benefits of living in a city, but also such a huge love for the wild and the ruggedness of Montana and environments like Montana. I live on a street called Bay Street in Santa Monica, and it's lined on both sides with these towering ficus trees that drop these really disgusting berries sometimes on the sidewalk. My mom would always complain about the ficus berries growing up, but if you're standing in front of my house, you'll see, a big concrete building painted orange which was not our decision. It was the decision of the homeowners association. But a big building painted orange and a lot of succulents in front of our house, in front of our door, just absolutely filled with eco-friendly, water-saving plants because of California regulations, and rocks instead of grass and those kinds of things. Then you'll see some bamboo trees to the right in our neighbors who are a mere 2 feet away from our buildings. And then on the left, you'll see a small little beachy sort of house with also palm trees that are touching our building. So quite close quarters. And in contrast, in Montana, our house and our property is along a river, the Clark Fork River. And you can't see our house from the driveway if you're at the front of our driveway. So it's a big difference, a couple feet of separation versus many, many steps of separation between us and the next person down the road. But you look down the driveway and you see what we call Grace Mountain, or as my mom used to call it, Grace Mountain, in front of you, towering with these huge rock slabs that are it seems to be cascading down the mountain, but they're really just rock. There's rock slides over hundreds and hundreds of years, but it's a very rocky mountain in the Rocky Mountains, with Douglas fir, ponderosa pine trees surrounding the bottom of the mountain. But you walk up the driveway for about a quarter of a mile, a little bit more, and then you would hit our house, which is not anything to write home about, by the way. It was a factory-built home in the 1970s, so it's nothing special, but it is special to me. But again, surrounded by tall grasses that seem to just swim in the wind when you're on the porch, and you see sort of a nice horizon of rolling hills in the background with even taller mountains behind that, and ponderosa pine and Douglas fir to your left, and you're just completely enclosed by nature. It's so quiet. So very, very different, but very beautiful, both of them in different ways. I've had an affinity for both places in different stages of my life, and I continue to love different aspects of those environments and those communities. My grandfather, his name was Harris Wilson. He was a forest conservationist, basically. It was his job, and he took it upon himself for it to be his job to take care of the forest. And he started out as one of the first smoke jumpers, which is, for people that don't know, where you jump out of a plane into a fire and you fight the fire. So it was a pretty cool job, I would say, but very dangerous. And I think he was, as a World War II veteran, he also had some experience in that kind of really intense combative situations. And so jumping out of a plane was no problem for him. And he originally grew up in North Dakota, but moved to Montana because the Forest Service was offering him a job. And this conservation question was quite new. My grandpa was born in 1922. So he grew up sort of in that Great Depression area, very frugal man, just wanted to be able to help himself and help his family. He and his wife, Estelle Wilson, who was my grandmother, they had 6 kids, and my mom was the second of 6 kids. So she was born in eastern Montana, where he was stationed at the time, in 1950, and eventually, after she had graduated high school and everything in eastern Montana, they relocated to western Montana because they were looking for foresters, and they said, we'd like you to relocate to this little town called Plains. They said, okay, sure, we'll move there. So my 3 uncles, my 3 uncles and 1 aunt grew up in Plains, Montana, and they basically spent their whole childhood in this beautiful place that was surrounded by trees and water, and just in a gorgeous place. And to situate Plains a little bit too, it's about halfway between Missoula, Montana, which is sort of a big city, and Glacier National Park, which quite a few people know about, in an insanely beautiful area of the country. So they were thrilled to move there, but they didn't have much, and so he was working really hard to not only provide for his family and help his many children, but also support his wife and try and support the Forest Service in their efforts to conserve land and to make healthy forests. And that was their focus. It was creating healthy forests, maintaining wildlife numbers, making sure that they had the habitats they needed to thrive in this part of the country and this part of the state in particular. And he just really wanted to be the best steward he could to the land he was able to. And his work was mostly in, public lands. It was in U.S. Forest Service lands, BLM lands, which I don't think were a thing at that time, but ended up becoming Bureau of Land Management. That's what BLM stands for. And those lands he did a great job tending to, but eventually in his retirement, he decided that after retiring from the Forest Service, he wanted to buy his own parcel of land in Noxon, it's about an hour and a half north of Plains. And so that was kind of his retirement project, was I'm going to have this plot of land for myself and I'm going to work on it and I'm going to make it absolutely pristine and beautiful and just, make it the best piece of forest that you could ever see. And it did look like that for a long time. And he worked through his 90s. He was 94 when he stopped tree farming. So he spent a lot of his life dedicated to the forest, and that was his happy place. Not only was it his happy place, but I really do think it was his home in a lot of ways, and his kids definitely saw that. And none of them actually went into forestry except eventually when my mom did. So my mom did not, obviously the place I'm living at is not the Noxon property. And my mom, they grew up in Plains, but they never had any land. They lived in town, they lived in the city of 1,000, So when my mom first got married to her first husband, Paul Van Arsdale, he saw how much she loved Montana, and he knew how special it was that she had a connection with her parents. My mom was always very close with her parents, and her first husband, Paul, really saw that and said, I would love to buy you some land. I would love to buy you some land so that you can work on it with your dad, so that your dad doesn't have to drive all the way out to Noxon. Your dad can just drive 15 minutes and then be in his happy place and work and really love what he's doing. And you can too if you wanted to. But unfortunately, shortly after they had purchased the properties, and after they had gotten married, he was diagnosed with cancer. And about 6 months later, after his diagnosis, he unfortunately passed away. So it kind of left my mom in a bit of a pickle because there was, he didn't buy the properties outright. So my mom had to work quite hard to pay off those debts. But she, it wasn't always her dream to be a tree farmer. She was a very talented singer and actress, and for a while, and that's why she moved to Los Angeles in the first place, where she met Paul. And so it was really hard for her to take a step back from that eventually. But she also had other skills. She was extremely organized. While she was acting, she also worked as a paralegal at Latham & Watkins firm in Los Angeles. That's how she met Paul. So she was very organized, a very good writer, a very fast typer for her generation. She was very fast at typing. And she had a lot of skills that really put her in a good position to manage this land and to make sure that it was taken care of in a way that made sense for the next generations of people who would take care of this land. And so she went to her dad for help after Paul died and said, I'm in a bit of a pickle. I really need to pay off some debt. Can you help me take care of these tree farms and get them working so that we can clear some of the dead and dying trees, make beautiful forests, and sell the logs in order to help pay off the properties. And within a couple years, she was able to do just that. And it was, obviously I was not around at that point, but I could imagine that was just a huge weight off of her shoulders, and being able to own these properties and really take into her own hands what would happen next with these pieces of land. And my grandpa and most of my family, if not all, the last thing they'd want to see happen to a parcel of land is it to be sold and subdivided and developed and basically destroyed. And that was such a message that was ingrained to me at a very young age, that if you're lucky, if you are so fortunate to have a piece of land, you have to be a steward to the land. There are no excuses. You cannot destroy the land by tearing it up, which is what's happening, unfortunately, to a lot of land right now in Montana, in a lot of mountainous, tree-filled communities, and other places too. It's just that the natural resources are important, but you need to make sure you prioritize the earth first and the people a little bit second, and making sure that you really pay attention to, okay, how can I impact the wildlife? How can I make a better environment for all the species of life that are living in this place? The major thing that my grandpa did when I knew him, and he was around from when I was born until I was 20 years old. And so I got to know him for 20 years of my life and grew up. When I was a kid, we would spend so much time in Montana that I would take a lot of, well, not take a lot, but when I would spend that time in Montana as a kid, we would always spend whole days out in the forest. And I didn't really know what was going on because I was just a kid. I was just running around for the most part. But I think subconsciously I was really taking note of all the different places that we were around and what I would see. And I mean, I think I was pretty curious as a kid. I don't know how curious really, but I think there are definitely pictures of me rolling around in the mud and, picking up grass and eating it. I think there are childhood things that I would do, but I don't think I realized how special that was, because a lot of people have to go to a playground to do that, and Montana was my playground. I mean, Plains was my playground. And to share it with my mom and my grandpa was just such a privilege, but in a way that just totally changed the way I view life now. And so I would say my role is more trying to continue my grandpa's work and my mom's work and doing the best that I can to educate myself. And, when I'm home in Montana, to really try and connect with what's around me. What kind of trees are we going to plant here? How are we going to, how can we do some selective cutting in certain areas to make way for a new wildlife population to thrive? We're noticing more bear activity in this part of the ranch. What can we do to help out those bears, or maybe get them out of that area? There are lots of decisions to be made. And my dad says this thing, he says, I have work here for the next 100 years and I'm not going to last that long. So I think that that's a pretty good descriptor of how much you can put in and what a role can look like in a place like that, is that there's no way you can finish what you're doing at this kind of, in nature at all. There's no finish line. There's no end. There's only perpetual motion of progress with how can you help the forest, and how can you be the best advocate for the land that you can. Music has always been such a big part of my life. Being active has also been a really big part of my life. I love hiking, I love swimming, I love all that stuff. It always kind of came back in my life to nature and to music, and to understand where those two intersect, and to integrate my violin playing with nature and integrate those two aspects into some writing components, and to also integrate that into community and connection with others, and being able to share this vision of life is a lot more than sitting behind a desk, and life is a lot more than plugging away at paperwork, even though that's important. I'm not going to discount that, but I do think that to really bring out the humanness of human interactions really reminds me every day that it's so possible to integrate nature and music and being active and eating wonderful food and sharing meals, and just those are all such passions of mine. And I think that I would not imagine my life without those things. And it's just been such an important part of my life, and I think it will be forever. I decided recently that I was going to commission 5 composers in the US and Canada to create sort of a intertwined story between natural disaster, the natural world, and communities. In 2023, in August, there was a pretty significant forest fire in Plains, around Plains, called the River Road East Fire, which is the road that I live on. And this fire sort of sparked something in me, not using sparked intentionally, but it did spark something in me that I saw how quickly a community could come together when a disaster like this happened. It burned over 18,000 acres around Sanders County, Montana, which is the county that Plains is in, and destroyed buildings and structures and homes of people. And luckily, I don't think anyone was killed. I don't think anyone passed away, but the devastation it brought to our landscape was just immense. I had never been that close to a forest fire. Forest fire is a part of life in Montana. You have to be ready for a forest fire. Fire season happens. It happens in all of the Pacific Northwest, and it's normal, but it's been really, it goes in cycles, I think. It's gotten quite a bit worse in recent years. And my dad is now a volunteer firefighter in Plains, and he was called to the scene immediately, and he was one of the first people to hear about the fire on his walkie-talkie. And he quickly rushed out and said, "Okay, Grace, you need to grab all the family pictures and all the important documents and all your stuff, and just like try and get everything together, put hoses around the house, but all this quick action that was just kind of flying by my head. I was like, oh my God, it was so fast. Everything happened so fast. And once we finally were able to connect with some community people and some community members about this, you could just see online, on Facebook groups, on, forums, making sure that people were okay. We got plenty of calls making sure that we were okay from our family and friends around Montana, and because they heard about it. It made the national news about this fire. So after that had happened, I took a gap year in between my undergraduate degree at St. Olaf and my master's degree, and that was very intentional. But during that gap year, I was sort of, it was an idea that was churning. Like, how do I connect these natural disasters that happen and the communities that it impacts? Whether that be a fire, a tsunami, an earthquake. I was just, you observe so much news going on in the world that you think, all this devastation, like how can people cope? And a lot of the times it's through community, but a lot of the times it's also through music.
Ona Graciae is the Latin word for the evening primrose family, of which fireweed is one of the children. When the ground has been scorched to death by the rampage of wildfire, there is a stench of smoldering death everywhere. The very first life form to take root in ground that has been scorched is from the family Ona Graciae. Traveling on the wind, these seeds seek a home in the open wounds of the ground. Fields, valleys, mountainsides, and the sites of bombings, wherever devastating loss of human, animal, and plant life has occurred. My friend Grace asked if we could collaborate on a new piece, one that speaks into the experience of one of her hometowns, Plains, Montana, a place that knows the terror and tragedy of wildfire well. We wanted to share a story of wildfire and name the grief that follows it. We also wanted to name its natural and necessary place in the web of life. Wildfires reveal the wholeness of landscape. Our eyes cannot see all the faces of a valley, a forest, or a mountainside. Only the eyes of time can see the fullness of a place and its truest self, as revealed by disturbance and renewal.
Fireweed is an early succession plant that comes in after a fire, and it prepares the soil for the middle succession and late successional plants. And it does that because it's able to germinate because of ash. So the chemistry of the soil is different. And these early successional plants will come in, and many of them are nitrogen fixing plants. But fireweed is not. You could have another change. It could have been a climate freeze, a deep freeze, something, but it triggers this earth renewal. But it's one of the most beautiful wildflowers, and it will cover miles.
Fireweed is the still small vessel of life that finds the place where life is needed the most. It seeds and takes root and spreads through the scorched earth. Whole valleys, mountainsides, and bombed-out buildings will see fireweed filling up the broken spaces and shining colorful purple reaching petals to the sky, as if life is saying, "I am still here."
You have to be connected to what's around you. You have to be aware and think about the world that I'm living in regards to things like climate change and regards to things like taking care of this planet, because I don't just want to do it for the benefit of myself and my family. I also want to do it for the communities that have brought me so much, and especially those in music.
Grace's story is rooted in her homes, her family, her creativity, and her communities, both in LA and Montana. She recognizes community everywhere she lives and is always ready to tend the spaces she is rooted so that life may flourish. Grace is a new member of the Earth Story community and joins us not just as a collaborator, but also as a new team member. She is drawing from her lived experience and her naturally communal intuition to help Earth Story grow and become its fullest expression of life. You will hear more from Grace and how she is shaping and enlivening this community in the time to come. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. Your listening presence allows these stories to live on in ways that will never fully be known. This has been a new story for a new week, the Earth Story podcast. May you have courage in the week to come and know that this earth depends upon your unfolding story.